Live from SABC headquarters in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo. On the show tonight,
we are determined that there must be transparency and accountability as the projects are costed and implemented, as well as how resources are deployed right from the beginning.
We'll be bringing
President Cyril Ramaphosa and his cabinet ministers vow to ensure that disaster relief funds go where they are supposed to. But are there adequate measures in place to address concerns that have been raised? We also do a roll call looking at what the ministers have been up to in the past 24 hours since that presidential address to the nation. Then our disaster management expert panel, comprising of engineers and climate specialists, looks back at the government's management of the disaster so far before they also weigh in on the work that lies ahead. All that coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts now. Well, the death toll in KwaZulu-Natal as a result of the floods has risen to 448. Here's the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal, Sihle Zikalala, earlier today giving a status report, giving us a lowdown on the numbers.
Minister Gordhan says the port is functional with ships being able to bring in imports and take out exports. Measures have been put in place for trucks to go in and out of the port area. Gordhan says there was major damage to the rail infrastructure and the bay.
KwaZulu-Natal has now lost the number of people who have died stands at 448. We've been reporting 443. But today, the search and rescue team recovered 5 additional bodies.
Earlier, the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, briefed the media on actions the government is going to take to assist those who have been affected by the floods. Our Abongile Dumako was at that briefing and brought us this report.
Effects on supply chains and the wider economy.
Our supply chains are highly integrated, and we have this movement of goods both by road and by...
Okay, we seem to be having problems.
Described as the worst floods yet. This led to President Ramaphosa declaring a national state of disaster. Dlamini-Zuma says the flood disaster will have a long-lasting impact on the residents of both the affected provinces. But aid from all spheres of government as well as from the private sector is on the way to provide relief for the thousands of people affected.
Some of the homes completely destroyed, about 4,000 of them, and some partially destroyed, but leaving more than 40,000 people homeless for now because they can't stay in their homes. And some of them have lost everything because they could only escape with what they had on them.
Dlamini-Zuma says it's too early to pronounce on the full extent of the cost and damage caused by the floods. However, infrastructure damage is estimated at millions of rands. Abongile Dumako, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, cabinet ministers were out and about doing their duties today on the back of that address by the president last night. The minister responsible for public enterprises was in KwaZulu-Natal, where he was doing some checks on infrastructure there. Here's Pravin Gordhan as he was doing his fair share of what is required of the members of the executive.
The basic message is Durban Harbour is functional. Secondly, that the ships that are bringing in imports are being serviced, and ships that are taking out exports, including food items or fruit, are also being serviced. As a result of the impact on Bayhead Road, we did have an issue where some 8,000 to 9,000 containers have accumulated, either because staff could not reach the harbour area or trucks could not reach the harbour area. And within the next 5 to 6 days, those 8,000 to 9,000 containers will be cleared as well.
Well, on the education front, which has been disrupted by this flood, it was the first day of schooling in KwaZulu-Natal, and Basic Education Minister Angie Motshekga was there. Well, she still is in the province to assess the impact of the damage in schools that have been affected by these floods. 57 learners, 1 teacher and 1 food handler died in the floods in the province.
I was glad that the President declared international disaster so that we can all bring our resources together. We'll be bringing professional teams from the Department of Basic Education. Our engineers will come and work with the engineers. We will bring whatever resources we have, books, as the principal is explaining that urgently, if we want them to go back to school, the books have all been destroyed. So we'll be really prioritizing, saying what is that we can do immediately, because we want schools to come back immediately.
Of course, ministers out and about. Education minister, you just saw there, the public enterprises minister earlier. Several other ministers are, of course, also in the province. In a short while, we're going to take you back to the president's speech last night about the work that needs to happen next. And on the back of that, we're going to have that expert panel that's going to look just at how the government has managed things up until this point, and of course the work that President spoke about, what needs to happen next, who needs to do what. Take a listen to some of the things that he had to say last night as he moved to declare a state of the state of disaster, which of course was gazetted today by the Minister of Cooperative Governance.
We are determined that there must be transparency and accountability as the projects are costed and implemented, as well as how resources are deployed right from the beginning.
We'll be bringing professional teams from the Department of Basic Education. Our engineers will come and work with the engineers. We will bring whatever resources we have, books, as the principal is explaining that urgently, if we want them to go back to school, the books have all been destroyed. So we'll be really prioritizing, saying what is that we can do immediately, because we want schools to come back immediately.
Structures like labor, community-based organization, business, religious sector are expected to be part of the broader oversight movement.
The ships that are bringing in imports are being serviced, and ships that are taking out exports, including food items or fruit, are also being serviced.
Climate change is here with us now, because the scientists have been telling us that the eastern part of the country is going to be wetter and will have frequent floods. The western part of the country is going to be drier and will have frequent droughts.
Well, on that note of the climate and the issues around that, among the members of the expert panel that we have this evening is someone who is going to speak to those issues. But we also have engineers who are going to talk about our public infrastructure. You know, were there things that could have been avoided, or the things that can still be done to better manage things going into the future? Is our public infrastructure as resistant as it should be? What's missing? What's there? What's to be reinforced? All those questions will be answered by our expert panel, whom I am talking to in a minute on the other side of this short ad break. Time to look now at how this disaster has been managed up until now, and with everything that the president told us last night about things that need to happen next, the monies that have been made or are going to be made available for the various things that need to be done. Our panel consists of Musa Mabuza, who is the CEO of the Council for Geoscience. We also have Valinavo Kavagali, who is the CEO and of a climate change specialist. And we also have Gundo Maswine, who will be joining us shortly. He's having some load shedding issues, but he is a civil engineer and an infrastructure specialist. He will also be joining us in a short while. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Good evening, Vuyo. Thank you for having us.
Great.
Thank you for having us.
Let me start with you, Musa. I mean, if I may, just looking back at, from the weekend when things started, the images we all saw. What immediately came to mind, about this? To you about the state of our infrastructure and, of course, its ability, its resilience.
So, Vuyo, as the first thing I must say is to convey sincere condolences to the families and friends of the 450 compatriots who perished in these floods, the 40,000 who are homeless, and obviously the 4,000 households that have appeared, which housed many families across the landscape of eThekwini. To come back to your question, I was reminded that exactly 3 years ago, there was a continuous rain for about 3-4 days in eThekwini. We had a very similar type disaster, albeit to a much lesser extent than the second time around. And this time, 3 years later, in April again, we've seen it to the extent that we have seen it. It became very clear that as South Africa, we have entered a completely new era that will require us to prepare ourselves differently going forward in infrastructure development, in infrastructure planning, and town planning. I am reminded of the many experiences that we have had in constructing infrastructure in dolomitic terrains. I think over the years, we have been able to use geosciences and couple it with civil engineering and other technical expertise to significantly mitigate the risks that are associated with infrastructure development in dolomitic terrains. It has become evident to me that certainly we need to extend these various sets of expertise into new areas of risk that are coupled with the climate environment that it would appear will be with us well into the future. It will become our new normal. It will require us to review our laws. It will require us to review our planning mechanisms. It will require us to consider what approval processes for infrastructure development going forward, and what sort of reinforcements are required in order to avert any loss of life as a result of these sorts of challenges that the people of eThekwini have and the surrounding areas have faced in the past couple of days in the main.
In other words, the things we need to do are, as we speak, not in place. And secondly, if I heard you correctly, given our most recent experiences, in particular the one that we saw about three and a half years ago in eThekwini, we don't seem to have learned from those.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, Vuyo. I would say that perhaps what we experienced 3 years ago was the first of its kind. As human beings, we may have thought it has come and it has gone. And it is clear that the climate in which we live has fundamentally changed. And the cycles of 3 years in the same area are quite frequent, and clearly there is a new trajectory of considering all of these things in an integrated manner. I think that some of them are done.
But can I chip in there, Musa? Can I chip in there? Because I mean, if the whole point of having teams of people from your area of work, which is geoscience, these are people who deal with oceans, rivers, atmosphere, lakes, soils, everything. The whole point of having those people in a country is to ensure that they prepare for those eventualities. In other words, you cannot say because you're nice and comfortable today that things are going to remain like that forever. That's the whole point of having emergency units, disaster management units, is to cater for those eventualities. And from what you've said up until now, if we do have those in place, we're not doing a great job.
I wouldn't be as hasty as you are, Vuyo, about the greatness.
Tell us where. Maybe you can briefly tell us what is in place. You know, what is in place from what you know currently to take or to cater for these eventualities.
So that's where I can contribute. I think as technocrats. Currently, the law that establishes us had limited us to dolomitic terrains. That is why I made reference to dolomitic terrains, because we had experienced disasters of sinkholes in dolomites. We learned from those disasters. We developed geoscientific expertise that evaluate the risks that are associated with infrastructure development in those dolomitic terrains. And ours is then to advise the relevant authorities on what are the reinforcement measures that can mitigate the risks.
Have you done so? Have you done so as professionals?
Well, this is not a dolomitic terrain.
Yeah. No. What I'm saying, you're saying that there are lessons to be learned, or that we should have learned from the experiences you've just described in dolomitic terrains. So those lessons would have then taken, and they would have helped us a great deal in dealing with our new reality. Now, what I'm asking is whether you have indeed, spoken, or those conversations have actually taken place, and whether, if they have taken place, measures were then taken to begin to deal with the other terrains.
So that's where I was going, Vuyo, before you interrupted me. I was saying that we build the expertise in the Dolomitic terrains. We have now learned that there is a need to extend the application of geosciences in other landslide susceptible areas, particularly where infrastructure is already installed. We had taken our founding legislation, amended it so that it can extend our mandate beyond the Dolomitic terrains. In the background, we have started to do some work that begins to delineate areas that we deem to be highly susceptible to landslide, as it were. And we were quite fortunate to have the legislators pass our recommendations. And beyond that, those provisions are currently still in abeyance. We are in the process of approaching the authorities so that they can be lifted out of abeyance, because the biggest challenge that we have in this country, that you know very well, Vuyo, is that we have a small and diminishing fiscus at a time when there are multiplicity of challenges that are growing that confront us as a nation. So some of these things, you have to move them and make proposals that require resources, having duly considered that you do not exist alone and you are the only one who's requesting resources in order to do the work that you do.
You know, when
Sadly,
you said that I mean, we were like legislation was passed, you suggested, or that's what I could read from what you're saying, that things moved with some speed. I was like, wow, that's great, because we don't have that reputation or history. We tend to take time to just pilot legislation in our country before things get to be implemented even. But then you then almost immediately thereafter said these things were put in abeyance. I was like, oh no,
no, let me clarify. You know, the provision is held in abeyance, but because we understood that this work is critical, so we continued to pilot a limited number of areas that we've put out. Last year, we published a map of landslide susceptibility at a very, very high scale. We have zoomed into other areas. South Africa is a large country. It is difficult to predict where to prioritize, where the hazard is likely to happen. But what I'm saying is we are in a much better position today, even before those provisions come into force. By the time they come into force, we would have long been ready to implement. And we have already initiated conversations with the district municipalities to preempt applications of district development modeling. I'm sure you have heard a number of authorities speaking about the DDM model, as it were. And our contribution as scientists to the DDM model, key amongst those is optimal land use. And in consideration of optimal land use, we will then present the geological setting in the area within which the district municipality let's use this platform to instruct municipalities work with us so we can inform so that
let's bring in Valinavo here. You spoke, Valinavo, Musaja spoke about the new era we are in, that we need to now prepare for, the new reality. The minister earlier spoke, the Minister of Cooperative Governance spoke about that as well. What is this new reality in a nutshell?
Evening, Vuyo, and to all the viewers. Let me echo the same message that my brother Musa has echoed, to send condolences to all the families that have been affected by these floods. The loss of lives, infrastructure, homes, and in many ways the different sources and alternative sources of income for all these communities. The reality is climate change is here, and we need to live with this effect. The new normality that the minister is referring to, it's documented in our climate change reports work that was conducted since 2011, called the long-term adaptation scenarios. And we were looking at that work in comparison to the global work which is done by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, which is IPCC, which was informing us that the temperatures have increased, and this will also affect our seasonal patterns. That is your rainfall and also your drought periods. You would have seen, Vuyo, that for the past 22 years, let me be brief on the timeline. In 2000, we've got a very good record that everybody will be able to remember, a child born on a tree. After such heavy floods that affected the sub-regional areas of Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa. The new norm is that is going to happen more frequently. You have seen that repeating itself in 2006. We have seen that. And in between those intervals, we are seeing high rainfall, which leads to floods, and drought seasons that follows. That patterns, which has been echoed quite a lot with our national communication reports. It used to indicate that South Africa has gotten into an era whereby we're going to have extreme weather events. That is rainfall, which leads to floods, and no rainfall, which leads to drought. That is what we are confronted with. We have dealt already with the day zero, which was experienced by Western Cape. We've dealt with quite a lot of snowfalls that has affected the Eastern Cape province. We have seen floods in the Eastern Escarpment, as the Minister of Copta has indicated, that is in Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and KwaZulu-Natal. We have also seen that the floods are in Gauteng, so it's not an exception that we've got in coastal provinces and also inland. It is not an exception. They are all getting affected one way or the other. But obviously, as you're indicating, it goes back to the infrastructure, it goes to our planning, it also goes to our corporate governance and approaches that we use in terms of dealing and addressing climate change issues.
Is there evidence that these reports that you've been writing year in and year out are taken seriously, and as a result of which adequate planning and preparation is actually happening? Is there proof of that?
There is definitely, Vuyo and the viewers. The reality is, how are we consuming this information that we are developing or producing? I, for one, worked with a team in the environment, in the former Environmental Affairs, which is Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, where we were developing climate change response plans. One, we started looking at national sectors. We've got reports for water and sanitation, human settlement, tourism, agriculture. We went on to work with national, went on to work with provinces. So all the provinces in South Africa, they've got a climate change response strategy. We went a layer down to look at cities and also district municipalities and local municipalities. So that work is there. We even went to an extent to look at policy alignment. So you will realize that when we revised the National Disaster Management Act in 2016, it was based on the fact that we have got disaster management as a response measure, which is under the corporate governance department, and you've got environmental issues, which are then mainly climate change, which is then mandatory under Ministry of Environment. So we then looked at what are the convergence and what could we put together to ensure that we address climate change risks and response measures under one particular act, which is a regulatory framework. So that plan is there. If you go to the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment website, we've got a page that is looking at long-term adaptation scenarios. We've got Let's Response toolkits. We've worked with local government association to implement that. At this time in point, as I'm in IUCN currently, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, we're also advocating for the implementation of these particular policies through different projects. For example, land rehabilitation and restoration. We are looking at nature-based solutions, which are also some of the imperatives from this particular report. So,
and that's where I wanted to go next. Was we don't have a lot of time. What I was saying is, I wanted to ask was, I mean, it's good enough to have those strategic plans and to be aware of what needs to happen, but implementing those is quite another. So what I wanted to ask you was, from what you know, are these plans actually being implemented?
Yes, one will say.
In other words, it's not a box-ticking exercise.
No, I think one will say implementation is never enough, because it requires, the policy provides imperatives that says, can we work with local government in terms of identifying climate change risks? And we do that. From there, we go into developing projects that will deal with localized climate change risks. And that is something that is underway. You will know that this requires not only government, but also non-governmental organizations. It's also taking place through business sector that are also contributing quite a lot of work in this. There are a lot of examples that I can talk to right now. There are projects. This, for example, is a bigger project on adaptation fund in Umgeni, KwaZulu-Natal, which was looking at ecosystem-based adaptation, which is an imperative from the climate change strategy. Right now, we are looking at other projects that are looking at capacitating local government officers to be able to integrate and mainstream climate change work into their mainstreaming work, which is your biodiversity, your conservation, and also your planning at local municipalities. So implementation is never enough. We just need to up the rate in terms of how we're implementing our policies. But the policies are there. They're very good, and they talk to specific and localized climate change risks.
Gundo, let's bring you in here. I mean, you've heard about, we've heard about the new normal, which we have to, adapt or adjust to. You heard Valinava saying work is being done, has been done. There's a lot, that we need to be proud of. Musa, I mean, has said as much. But I mean, as an infrastructure specialist and a civil engineer, how resilient is our public infrastructure, would you say?
Thanks, Will. I think that's an important question to ask, because as Balinabo was just saying now, translational research has not happened as much as we would have wanted. So what the universities have been doing and what the public sector has been practicing, there's a big gap. So for that reason, all the advances in research, all the outcomes of our research efforts have not really found their way into practice. So that translational issue is a problem. So I can say that our infrastructure is not resilient by and large, as evidenced by what has happened in KwaZulu-Natal. Because when infrastructure is resilient, it means what we are trying to protect using the infrastructure will remain protected. And if anything has to be lost, it will be just the infrastructure itself, not the livelihood and not the lives. So that is a measure of how resilient our infrastructure is.
I mean, this death toll that keeps on rising is quite high by any standards. So the obvious question that people have been trying to get answered this whole week is, what can be done immediately from an infrastructure point of view, to protect lives and that very infrastructure itself.
What needs to happen now is we need to visit those areas. Fortunately, nature has pointed to us which areas are vulnerable, but we also have the tools to model the patterns of stormwater, and we know how soil will behave at what level of saturation. So we should be able to identify these areas that are vulnerable especially those that have a lot of people staying in them, areas with dense populations. And then take the measures to prevent loss of life, especially that's where we should start. So we cannot completely prevent all the damage, but there are some small gains that we can make by reviewing, by modeling our stormwater flows, by doing hydrological studies. Because what is actually happening now is that what we used to expect to be a 50-year flood line seems to be happening in less than 10 years, every 10 years, in 10-year intervals, sometimes even 5-year intervals. So that is what needs to happen now from a practical point of view.
Now, to someone I say, it does look like, yes, a lot of work is being done, but we're not there yet. So many things have to be done, and some dependent on other things, including money. How does a family, for example, a household, sort of protect, themselves? What are the sort of things that people can do to check, for example, whether, my home is susceptible to, or can, I'm in danger, or what can I do to protect my home? Those kinds of the basic things that people can do themselves.
If the home is already built, and maybe in many cases, the houses are built without the input from a geotechnical engineer. So the foundation does not take into account what will happen if there are heavy rains. It doesn't account for the fact that you might have built on a slope, or you have built on soils that are easily collapsible when there is rain. It might be important to get the services of a geotechnical engineer and a hydrologist, a civil engineer who has experience in stormwater management, to look at your house and model what will actually happen when a storm of a particular magnitude comes to the area where your house is.
Are the fees for such services within the reach of many people?
They are surely not as expensive as the fees of having to rebuild the house from scratch. But I also think in instances like this, municipalities themselves, through their disaster management budgets, should be able to preemptively, because some of these studies can be done for an area and not necessarily for just one house per se. Mm-hmm. So in which case, I do feel that there might be, it's really an imperative now for engineers in local government or in provincial or national government to start looking at doing regional hydrological studies, modeling stormwater flow, and so on, so that we can prevent disaster. At the West, we might need to invest on early warning mechanisms where we say, look, you have built here, we cannot immediately build for you elsewhere, as we know there's a challenge with housing provision. But there has to be some sort of emergency drills where people can be forewarned and alternative accommodation can be made. Mm-hmm. Because our first priority should be to prevent loss of lives. Mm-hmm. And surely science is advanced enough to model some of these calamities, and the different scenarios can also be modeled. There's even software, different softwares like HackRest that actually can model stormwater flow.
Musa, is there a way of hastening these processes? Because much as you may all be proud that a lot of work has been done already, and at some point things did move with a bit of speed. Fact of the matter is that we're not or nowhere near, by admission of all of you, we're nowhere near where we should perhaps be. How do we now create these conversations, not only these conversations, but get people to move with a bit of speed?
So, Vuyo, I think on our side, there are numerous areas that we have already developed, albeit at a very high regional scale, the vulnerability maps that show hotspots for geohazards. And geohazards are characterized not only by landslides, but they are also cumulative and sometimes once-off seismic events. And our country is increasingly seismically active. We are seeing incremental seismic activities in our country as we haven't previously. So if you look at a suite of attributes to this risk that Gunto eloquently puts, that we should be able to do something at regional scales which may contribute to a level of an early warning mechanism of sort. This will require the likes of the Council for Geoscience to work with COGTA and the municipalities, the civil engineering establishments, amongst others. There was mention of hydrologists, and I fully agree that in particular, water plays a critical role in contributing towards the stability of the ground as well as a major consideration. Okay. So there are already disaster committees that are established at various structures of and levels of government, national, provincial, and to the level of district municipality in the main. So it should be easy to invoke that approach with the learning of the disaster that has brought us here today, okay, so that the lives of the hundreds of people who have passed it can indeed be honored with us doing something positive to avert the recurrence of the same into the future. Okay, I think it is one thing that we can do with pride. Okay, thank you.
Balnabo, quick last words from you about what can be done to save lives.
A quick one, View. I think we have a great opportunity for South Africa to look at disasters in one way or the other. One, we've got a youth that requires quite a lot of training in climate change, disaster risk reduction, and also opportunities with regard to responding to environmental measures. So I think this is a call to the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment to partner with those NGOs that are within that frame to work closely on environmental issues. Secondly, we've got a mandate to respond to the NDP, which is the environmental sustainability and building resilience. So we have got also an opportunity there to say, how do we capacitate our community, but also accelerate resources? That is your funding for this project at local area. We also need to enhance the marriage between different governance and legal frameworks that will assist different government departments to talk to each other and ensure such kind of calamity does not take place any further. So as IUCN, I think we are looking at nature-based solution as one of the critical issues because it brings the ecosystems, the environment, the specialists, and also policy levels to engage the youth in terms of dealing with some of these issues around disaster risk reduction. We join hands with all the communities to say, let's work together, let's take the responsibility of working our land sustainably so, because it's important that we need to understand that people must be disciplined, they must understand where to build, they must follow the special development framework for different municipalities so that they don't find themselves building in flood-prone areas or disaster-prone areas, which is exactly what we are seeing over and over again. So we are going to see the climate reality taking place each and every year where we are met with these extreme events, and we will end up not knowing what we need to do, whereas we've got plans, tools, and systems that can allow us to do that. The National Framework for Climate Services led by weather services, will also assist us in terms of forecasting and early warning systems and ensuring that we can send messages to the different communities at different levels.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Hopefully we'll be able to talk more about these issues, and not only when we have the disaster that we people in KwaZulu-Natal and parts of the Eastern Cape are experiencing at the moment. But let me thank all three of you for agreeing to come on the program this evening and enlighten us on some of these matters. Well, there have been calls for vigilance in the administration of the flood relief funds that the government has promised. Yesterday, the president did give the assurance that the government is going to do everything in its power to make sure that that indeed happens. And today, Minister in the Presidency, Mondli Kungubele, also assuring South Africans that there is going to be close monitoring of how the funds to assist with the KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape floods disasters are used. He says government departments, including Treasury and the Auditor General, will ensure, as the President said last night, that the cash is properly utilized. Take a listen to what he said on our sister program a little earlier.
Already from within government, Treasury, which is finance, and the TPME in the presidency, together with the AG as assurance structure, seamlessly have already started working together in that regard. In other words, M&E framework and so on, it has been shared with the Disaster Management Center. And what the president said is that structures like labor, community-based organization, business, religious sector are expected to be part of the broader oversight movement. So it is in that context, but other structures which we are in control of, which is Treasury, DPME, and of course under AG on the other side, those structures are already at work.
Well, one organization that has been calling for the things that the minister in the presidency just spoke about and what the president spoke about yesterday on the matter of corruption is, of course, Corruption Watch. And on the line is Melusi Ngala from Corruption Watch. Melusi, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. From the assurances the president gave last night and from what you just heard the minister in the presidency saying, are you convinced that the government is indeed taking this matter seriously, and as they promise, they're going to do everything in their power to make sure that money goes where it is supposed to go?
Good evening, Rio, and thank you for having us this evening. I guess it's a matter of cautious and being cautious and also just marginally skeptical about how this is going to play out. It's a movie that we've all seen before, and it's still fresh in our minds in terms of PPE corruption scandals in the last 2 years following the outbreak of the pandemic. So, then too, there was a lot of lip service to issues of corruption, a lot of grandstanding, a lot of assurances given, and especially in relation to the disbursement of funds that were needed at community level. Yet, tens of billions of rands were lost and are unaccounted for. And, investigations have shown that there's been serious irregularities, serious wastage of funds, there's been theft of goods and all those kind of things. And so too does our data. So we wait with bated breath and, of course, call on the communities and the organizations, as invited by the presidency, of course, to be not just broadly aware of what's happening, but to be have a vested interest in the disbursement of the funds in that region, so that we can actually make sure that the people who most need the goods and services actually receive them.
I mean, among the things you're calling for is for oversight bodies and civil society to be able to monitor both allocations and spending. You go further to mention that, or to call for the Auditor General to be activated to do real-time audits of spending, which did happen, during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, but which still didn't stop, unscrupulous people from doing what they did.
Yes, we didn't necessarily see, for example, real-time auditing, and we didn't necessarily also see government coming to the people on a regular basis, making declarations of saying this is where we currently stand in terms of money that needs to be spent. These are the people that have bid it. These are the qualifications. This is how they're going to go about the businesses that needs to be done. That's not something that government necessarily took us in confidence into as a society on a regular basis. If anything, the only thing that we were mostly exposed to are the investigations following whistleblower complaints. And those are very critical, as you know, because that's how we got to know about these PPE corruption scandals. So this time around, what we're saying is that due to the trust deficit, and which is rightly so, I don't think anyone is thinking to themselves that, that the politicians and the administrators running government are doing so in a moral and ethical way. So, which is why we're asking that, to bridge that divide, that we actually government takes us into confidence and say that this is how we're going about actually being accountable to the people and making sure that money is spent in a wise and proper way. Not what we've seen before, where there's a lot of people have suspended normal rules, given that, it's permissible under these kind of circumstances. But it seems like with them suspending normal rules also went intelligence and morality as well.
Well, I mean, the idea of suspending the normal rules was, at least we were told, to ensure, that service delivery doesn't suffer or crumble under the yoke of, a system that delays where, decision-making is delayed. And so, in other words, whoever came up with that was well-meaning, except not everyone in the system was.
But yeah, integrity is of paramount importance. That is why some of these people get voted into these very important positions. And once they start abusing that power, that's when we start seeing the manifestation of corruption. It cannot be that when you're given a very important responsibility to say, take care of these vulnerable human beings, and yet you see an opportunity to say that, no, how am I going to benefit as an official? That cannot be the case. And hence, there's this strong sentiment that people want to see accountability, and people are feeling a bit despondent and very distrusting of government and its intentions, because, there comes some of the, especially heading towards conferences and so on, people will make the argument that comrades are thinking of opportunities of lining their pockets.
Okay, that's why we're going to leave it. Thanks very much for your time this evening, Melus Ngala, who is from the organization Corruption Watch. They are calling for vigilance in the administration of KZN flood relief funds. And that brings us to the end of tonight's program. To join us again tomorrow evening, 8 p.m. sharp.